This is Jessica Anderson, Executive Director of Heritage Action. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to our Conversations with Conservatives as we talk with Speaker Newt Gingrich today about the fight for America. It's an honor to have him on the line. He's dialing in from Rome, Italy, where he is stationed with his wife's role with the Vatican. We're thrilled that he could be on with us. You all know him. He doesn't need much of an introduction. But of course, we'll rewind back to the 90s when he made a splash in conservative politics with his contract with America. That led to the Republican House majority in 1995. And of course, Speaker Gingrich was Speaker of the House from 95 to 1999. Since then, he has been very, very busy. He hosts a podcast called Newt's World. You should definitely all check it out. And he's also the author of over 20 books, which is pretty impressive to write at that volume. His latest book is a bestseller and one we all should pick up a copy of, Trump and the American Future. Speaker Gingrich, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you. And I'm always eager to have a chance to talk with people at Heritage because you have been such an important part of the evolution of modern conservatism. My ties to Heritage go all the way back to the 1970s and Ed Fulmer in the very beginning of the idea that we could have a major think tank that was conservative. And I'm now watching Kay James do a marvelous job of leading Heritage. And of course, Heritage Action is a very powerful outgrowth of that intellectual commitment and very important at the grassroots level. So, Jessica, when you offered me this opportunity, I had to say yes.
Well, thank you for being here. I know our membership and our Sentinels and our grassroots are thrilled at the chance to get you one-on-one today. So I thought it might be good to start with what's on everyone's mind. They watched you on Fox News this week. You had a little bit of a dust up. And to set the stage for this, really the last few years, you have been such a leading voice against progressive district attorneys or DAs. Those are those folks that are refusing to lock up violent criminals. You have a whole chapter in your book actually devoted to this. And you were on Fox trying to talk about this. And it was a rather bizarre or awkward moment there, but you were right. So what happened this week? What's happening with our DAs? Tell us a little bit about what's going on at the local level.
Well, you are right. When I wrote Trump and the American Future, I wanted to put a whole chapter on the degree to which the left has become pro-criminal and anti-police. Now, I have to tell you, we completed that book in March. We had no idea that the summer would explode and we'd have things like the recent tragic shooting of two deputies and a mob standing in the middle of a emergency room entrance, chanting, "Let them die." I mean, so the degree to which this cancer of anti-Americanism has metastasized is really much faster than I would have guessed when I wrote the book. What happened, to be fair to Fox, we were doing Outnumbered, which is a show normally where you have 5 people on a couch, 4 women and 1 guy, who's the one who's outnumbered, which I personally find always to be it's a great show. I like the show very much. And because it was a virtual show, we couldn't see each other. When I do free podcasts and free newsletters at Gingrich 360. And recently we had both Rudy Giuliani and his police chief, Bill Bratton, did separate podcasts about fighting crime because they are the most successful crime fighters in modern America. They reduced the murder rate in New York at an extraordinary speed. And Bratton made the point, I was asking about Chicago, which has had a huge long-term problem of people being killed, including 7, 8, and 9-year-olds. And he said, the problem's not the police. He said, the problem is we have this new generation of district attorneys who are dedicated to putting people back on the street and who are very anti-police. And so I've decided one of my goals in life, you can pass on to the other folks at Heritage, is to drop the word progressive because people either don't know what it means or it sounds okay, and replace it with these are anti-police, pro-criminal district attorneys. When the district attorney was sworn in Portland, for example, he released 600 prisoners the next day.
Wow.
You discover again and again and again. And what has happened is George Soros has spent the last 5 years spending millions of dollars in these local elections that normally aren't very well funded And so he's been going in and electing people who are very radical. And I would argue that the Soros's effort to replace traditional law enforcement with a anti-police, pro-criminal district attorneys probably is the biggest single influence on the rise of crime in the country in the last 2 years. So I brought this up on when we were talking about it, and one of the participants, who to be fair, had been the spokesperson for John Kerry at the state. And so as a good Democrat, she jumped in immediately, because I think the Democrats know if Soros ever becomes a national issue, that he is just, it'll wipe them out. I mean, he's utterly indefensible. He's a radical left-winger. He is totally opportunistic and ruthless. And what he's trying to do basically would destroy America. So she jumped in, somebody else jumped in, and then Harris Faulkner was caught up as the host. And I'm sure she had in her ear somebody saying, "Get us out of this segment," probably because there was a commercial break. Now, and then so when he got cut off, I just said, so Soros is for both. Well, for some reason, that 40 seconds or whatever it was went viral. I mean, the number of people who've written me, texted me, a couple of cases called me, has been amazing. And my guess is, and Soros went to, I think, number 2 on Google in terms of people looking things up. So my guess is we got 500 times as much attention to Soros and his role in electing pro-criminal, anti-police district attorneys as we would have gotten if they had just been cheerfully pleasant.
Well, it certainly made for must-see TV. And as we watched that unfold, I actually was catching it live. I literally looked around and said, "Oh my goodness, what is going to happen?" A rare moment of unscripted television. But the heart of what you're talking about is so true. And for myself, I'm a mother. I have 2 young children, and the millions of other Americans across this country that rely on the police and law enforcement to keep us safe. It really has been a mind-boggling summer that so many on the left have come out with full frontal attacks on law enforcement. And I don't know if you've seen these yet, but at Heritage Action, we wanted to do something about that. And so we put up these huge city-long, multi-story big billboards in the middle of Times Square. And you're going to love the message. The message says, "No police, no peace." And it's got a picture of an officer looking straight ahead at you. And, we know we need law enforcement. We back the blue here, and we want to see law enforcement be able to do their jobs. And you referenced the ambush in Los Angeles over the last weekend. When I saw that happen, the video of it, not only was it horrific to see what happened to those officers, but that was an all-out assault on law and order itself. And Americans look at that. I think swing voters are looking at that. We are concerned about the direction this country could go if the left's rhetoric becomes policy. So let's talk about that for a minute. How do you see public safety and the issue of security resonating with voters in the lead up to November 3rd? Is it going to be an issue? Will it impact voter turnout? What's your sense of that today?
Well, I think it already is impacting voters. I think that it is. In places like Oregon, the over 100 days of demonstrations have alienated people outside of the central city. I think when you look at New York, with de Blasio's almost terrible lack of leadership, they've had a 165% increase in the number of shootings this August compared to last August. I think people are fleeing the city. The number one purchasers of guns right now are women. And I think it's because they have this sense of genuine fear. And I also think when you get below you begin looking at public opinion polling, you realize that for all of the media's effort to convince us that Black Lives Matter and that we're supposed to salute and do exactly what we're told, over 80% of the country believes you need more police. The places that feel this the strongest, actually, are Black neighborhoods that are the most deeply attacked by criminals. And so I think this will be a big issue. I think it is an issue which ultimately hurts the Harris-Biden ticket, and I think helps Trump. And I think the fact that Harris herself has been such a pro-criminal, anti-law enforcement person further compounds that and makes it much harder for them to reach out. And of course, you're now seeing virtually every police union endorse Trump, and that's a real change. I mean, you now have in big cities people whose family, their family and their neighbors, they represent thousands of voters who used to be automatically Democrats, and now they're just saying we can't do it anymore.
You know, Mr. Speaker, you referred to the Democrat ticket as the Harris-Biden ticket. And I don't know if that was a slip or intentional, but I think it goes to the heart of what we're dealing with Mr. Biden, and that he is really an empty vessel and is beholden to the most leftward leaning part of his conference. But you did say that, Harris-Biden, and I got to give you props for that.
I was quoting Vice President Biden.
There you go.
Who the other day said that it was the Harris-Biden ticket. Now, she didn't even include him. She talked the day before about the Harris administration. So I'm pretty happy. I recently did a piece on President Wilson had a very severe stroke in 1919, and his wife, Edith, actually ran the country a year and a half. She wouldn't let anyone in to see him. She would take papers in and come back out, having made the decisions. So whether that means that we'll face the future of Jill or Kamala, I'm not sure. But my guess is that Kamala is the more ruthless and the more aggressive. And I have no doubt that in a head-on collision, that Kamala's willingness to fight and her will and just her sheer energy level will overwhelm Biden. So I think he was right. I always talk now about the Harris-Biden ticket, and I think it also helps communicate to people how radical. She was scored this last year as the most liberal member of the Senate, which means that she was to the left of Elizabeth Warren and to the left of Bernie Sanders. So you can imagine how hard you have to work to get to be the most liberal member of the Senate.
Well, I definitely think all of this is on the mind of conservatives, on the mind of swing voters, on the minds of Americans across the country. Turning now to another subject that is on the mind of voters is the administration and our country's response to the coronavirus, to COVID-19. And one of the things that we're seeing impact in such a real way, not just the economy, but now the educational experience, with schools having hybrid models where some are virtual, some are in person. Kids are having to wear masks, get temperature checks to walk in. I mean, it really is daunting to see what the educational experience is for our children right now. So what is your sense on the policies that lawmakers should be prioritizing, should be looking at and considering to really help families, students, educators adapt to the fallout of the pandemic? How do we get past this at our schools?
Well, look, I think the teachers' unions decided this gave them leverage to blackmail in order to go back to work. So some of them, like the Los Angeles Teachers Union, came up with totally absurd demands that had nothing to do with education, nothing to do with school. I think that the science is pretty straightforward. Young people don't tend to be bothered by the disease. So they are more likely to be bothered by depression, thoughts of suicide, drug addiction. And when we keep them isolated, I mean, the Center for Disease Control said 25% of American young people had contemplated suicide. Well, that's because they're socially isolated. And we're a social species. We like to be with people. And so I think that a great deal of this was a hysterical overreaction. And I think that we will discover, and I'm talking to you from Rome, they're back in school. They're in school in Luxembourg. They're 100%. I mean, and they're not hybrid. They're in school because it turns out, particularly for younger people, that being in a room, focusing, having the whole thing be about education is just dramatically more effective. As you get older, you can do virtual learning better. But when you're very young, particularly if you're from a poor neighborhood and you have no support mechanism, you need, it's going to cripple your life if you lose 2 or 3 years to this kind of timidity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that as parents realize exactly what's at stake for their children, you're starting to see this uprising of moms, of parents getting more involved in their children's education, much like the Common Core moms of a few years ago. I'm starting to see in the grassroots these little activism pockets popping up. And at the end of the day, I love to see that, because I want parents more involved in their children's education, having relationships with school board members, principals, and really not having this hands-off approach to the next generation's education. So maybe by the end of this, we'll look back and say that at least this pandemic caused us to look more closely at how our children were being educated.
Well, one of the things we've learned from the ability to stream information is that maybe we ought to have a rule that if you take federal tax money, your classroom has to be available to the parents to be able to tune in and watch what's being taught to their children. And I think it would come as a huge shock to a lot of Americans to realize what kind of left-wing propaganda is being fed their children.
Talk about accountability. That would send a shiver down all of these school board unions' backs. But some good accountability is certainly needed. Transparency is needed, and we'll continue that call. Education was obviously a subject matter and a policy issue that you've written on before. It was part of Contract with America. And so I'm curious, if you were to create a new Contract with America today, what sort of policy issues would you include and highlight to prioritize?
Well, I think the biggest challenge to the United States is to overhaul our education system. So the first thing I would do is I'd look in, and there are two really different problems. One problem is the degree to which K through 12 simply isn't functioning. I mean, if you go to a place like Baltimore, which is the fourth most expensive school system in the country, there are entire buildings where not a single child can pass the state exam, not one. And so you have to ask yourself, what's going on here? Clearly the students aren't being students, the teachers aren't being teachers, and it turns out the Baltimore system's a device to pay off the union, but it has nothing to do with education. So I think at K through 12, we need a very dramatic shift towards accountability. And I think that inevitably means school choice and parents having an ability to both know what's happening with their child and to have an alternative to being put into a bureaucratic building. I think when you get above that level, the president's beginning to move in the right direction. I really like the history panel that he announced this week and the whole notion that we ought to go back and look at and focus on the period of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. And I think that we need to have a pretty head-on argument about the right of left-wing teachers to brainwash their kids and teach them total nonsense. I think that that's a fight we desperately need as a country. And that's going to mean, I think, ultimately abolishing tenure and saying no. I mean, for example, there are a whole group of wackos who are math teachers who don't believe in math. And they argue that math is actually a sign of Western supremacy. And you look at that stuff and you think, why would you pay that person to be in a classroom? And so I think there's a very profound change both in K through 12 and in how I would deal with universities and colleges. I think second, that we have to have a very large infrastructure program. We're not today capable of competing with China in terms of the efficiency of our infrastructure systems, and that has to be a major goal. And then third, I'm a very deep believer that getting into space, being the dominant power in space, creating an ability to make money in space. It's already $1 trillion a year industry. People don't realize this. But literally, space worldwide, it's about $1 trillion a year now. Your weather channel, for example, the GPS, all sorts of things. In the next 20 years, it's going to explode. And if we invest in making sure that the cutting edge of that explosion is American, it'll repay us in national security, it'll repay us in economic growth, and it will repay us in scientific knowledge. So I'm a very big believer that we need a profoundly bigger space program than we have now.
Maybe our space exploration can help pay off some of our national debt.
Well, there's one particular asteroid that has been estimated to be worth $9 trillion, not billion, $9 trillion.
Wow.
It's apparently pure platinum. Now, actually, if you brought that much platinum back, you'd drop the price. But the point is, there are a lot of things in space we don't fully understand yet, and it will be one of the biggest areas of growth, including, for example, putting up systems to generate electricity from solar power in space, where you have access to the sun 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, and it's not diluted by the atmosphere. So the Chinese are very, very keen on that. I believe it's very real.
Let's turn our attention to another subject that you and I have in common, which is the power of conflict. You know, one of the things at Heritage Action that we often quote of yours from your time as speaker is that you said something along the lines that the press isn't going to report on anything. You give them conflict, they'll report on it, and then you can drive a narrative. You know, we live by that at Heritage Action. We are constantly holding members accountable, trying to get conservative policies out in the grassroots and then to advocate for them here in Washington. And it's not always the easiest thing to do. So in looking back and reflecting on your time as speaker, are there any lessons from that period that can be adapted to what we're facing here today? Things that you would want us to take forward as the grassroots army of 2020?
Yeah, I believe all planning should start by going out 20 or 30 years and asking yourself, what would success be like? Mm-hmm. And then sort of like you're standing on a hill, so you look at all 360 degrees around you to get a feel for that success. And then you figure out what are the bridges you have to build to get from here to that success. But you never start from where you are right now. I would say that the two biggest things that we didn't get to while I was speaker were dealing with the disaster in higher education and taking head on this whole degree to which, Ronald Reagan once said, it wasn't the things that they didn't know that scared him. It was the things that they knew that weren't true. And you see a lot of that with the academic community. And then second, I think we have to think through a new model for dealing with the bureaucracy. Somebody suggested the other day, maybe you get a 10-year appointment and then you get 5-year renewals, but you don't get lifetime. You're not going to sit in that bureaucracy in one of those big buildings in Washington for your entire lifetime. And that the renewals are a function of whether or not you're performing. But there is a deep state. It basically operates to its own rhythm. I always recommend to people that they either read or watch two great works, Yes, Minister and Yes, Prime Minister, because while they're about Great Britain, all the lessons are also true here. The bureaucracy's capacity to avoid allowing elected officials and the public to change things is really remarkable. And that's one of the things I think that we didn't do as effectively as we should have. I give Trump a lot of credit. He came up with the idea you have to repeal 3 rules for every new rule. And that's had a really big effect on the bureaucracy and led to the largest amount of deregulation in American history.
In a lot of ways, I think President Trump would say he's not yet done with that mandate for dereg and is trying to go further and do more on the deregulatory space. And I think you've even seen aspects of the Trump administration really take a shovel to the administrative state. You look at the borrowing in rule, you look at the work that he's trying to do with civil servants. And so there's certainly an appetite for that type of accountability, but also procedural and process changes. Policy may get front evening news, but those small behind the scenes meticulous process changes are really, I think, going to end up being some of the hidden value that we look back on this Trump administration. And speaking about your book, I definitely want to let you talk a little bit about that. Trump and the American Future. What inspired you to write this? What was your favorite part of it? If people are picking this up today, what chapter should they turn to first? Give us a little behind the scenes look on Trump and the American future.
I started to think about it in November, and thank you very much for asking. But I started thinking about it in November because I thought this would be an extraordinarily important election. And I thought the news media would be overwhelmingly biased against us. And I wanted to create an environment in which you or anybody else would have a workbook, if you will. And when an issue came up, you could go to the chapter for that issue. And it's really funny. I almost finished the book by the end of February, and it was a triumphalist book. We had the best unemployment in modern history, the lowest African American unemployment ever, the lowest Latino unemployment ever. Children were coming out of poverty because their parents were getting jobs and getting pay raises. And everything looked like it was set for Trump to just roll to re-election. And then, of course, the Chinese virus showed up. The government created an artificial depression, and it's all been a mess ever since. So I had to actually go back in March and rewrite about a third of the book to take into account. Yeah. No, it was you're sitting there thinking, you can't issue this because the world had changed. And I was very fortunate because we had, for example, Dr. Fauci came on my podcast in early February. So we were keeping track of these things all the way through as they were evolving. But I would say I'm probably proudest, actually, of the chapter on crime that talks about the Democrats being pro-crime and anti-police, because I would never have dreamed when I wrote that chapter how vividly July, August, September would make clear that the Democrats have become a party that deeply dislikes the police and that finds every possible excuse to put criminals back on the street. So that's probably, I mean, it's kind of a weird chapter to like that much because it's not a positive topic. But we have a long section on space. We have some great chapters on healthcare, and the whole goal was to lay out for people how to explain Trump and the Trump administration, despite all the things that the propaganda media of the left would say and do. And I'm very proud of it. I think that Trump and the American Future actually is a very helpful book for the campaign.
Well, thank you for that. We've got a big stack of them that are going out to our grassroots so they can pick up a copy, read these pearls of wisdom, and then get to work. I've got one more question for you.
Okay.
40 some odd days till November 3rd. You know, we're in the countdown. We're in silly season. We've been in silly season for like 2 years, but we're right in the thick of it. What is your advice to conservative grassroots in these last 40 days? What should they be doing? Where should they put their effort towards, their money towards, all of that? Where should their fire be aimed at?
Well, I think you get the most impact for your money in House races because they need the money the most. I think you get the second most impact for your money in Senate races. And you get the third most in the presidential race, which is the most glamorous, but also has the capacity to fund itself. We have a real chance, I think, to have a very big victory for president, to gain probably 2 seats in the Senate net, and to have Kevin McCarthy, who's just launched a very, very good Commitment to America program, to have Kevin McCarthy show up as a speaker after Election Day. It's going to take a lot of work for all that to happen. But I would say to people, one, obviously donate if you can. Remind your friends and neighbors to donate. I mean, after all, it takes a lot of everyday folks to offset Bloomberg when he comes in for $100 million in Florida alone. And this is really a fight between, it's fascinating. It's a fight between the oligarchs and the people. I mean, can the rich left-wing billionaires drown the American people, or will we in fact fight back and stop them? And I have a lot of faith in the American people, so I think we will. I would say second, talk to everybody you can from now to Election Day. Keep reminding them what's at stake, what a Harris-Biden administration would be like, what Nancy Pelosi would be like if she was able to work with Harris, and recognize that this really is the future of America. And then third, I would say volunteer to be a poll watcher. The greatest danger the president has will be the effort by the Democrats to steal the election. And we need the maximum number of volunteers helping us watch the voting process and making sure that we minimize the Democrats' ability to steal.
Awesome. I agree. And Heritage Action is committed not only to identifying poll watchers and poll workers, but also training them. So we've been on the ground trying to provide that training, make sure precincts have people in place in time. You know, you have to actually get trained now so you can be approved to be there on November 3rd. So time is certainly of the
Well,
essence.
and let me say, by the way, you have in Hans von Spakovsky, one of the great experts on election law and on fraud in America. I've done podcasts with him. He's amazing, and Heritage can be very proud of the work that his team has done on identifying fraud, and it's beginning to sink in that there's a lot more there than people thought.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Mr. Speaker, thank you so much for your time today, for being so generous with your thoughts with us. And we hope we can have you again and certainly stay in touch. Absolutely.
Thank you. Take care now.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you to everyone for joining Conversations with Conservatives and our fight for America. I look forward to our next time together, and you can continue to follow us at heritageaction.com. And of course, if you haven't signed the police pledge yet, please do so at policepledge.com. Thank you.